Well, this year, Christmas and Hanukkah fell on the same day for the first time in almost 2 decades. And Peter Dutton, who has been one of the strongest allies of the Jewish community, didn't mince his words in his Hanukkah message. He wrote, "This Hanukkah, I reiterate to Jewish Australians, and indeed all Australians who cherish our way of life, that a Dutton coalition government will provide moral clarity, deliver strong political leadership, and act decisively to restore law and order." And what's evident there is what we do not have at the moment, lacking in law and order enforcement and a very weak leadership. Well, joining me now is my panel author and senior history lecturer at Campion College, Stephen Shovura, and Sky News contributor Evelyn Ray. Thank you both for your time tonight. Now, Stephen, I spoke earlier in the show about the difference, how it couldn't be more stark between Dutton's rhetoric about this extremism crisis and Albanese's. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. And the Labor Party in general were just sort of shamefully ambivalent on this issue. Really ever since the massacre took place a bit over a year ago. For example, very early on, almost immediately after the massacre, Penny Wong pledged $10 million to Gaza, which anyone who knows anything about funding to Gaza knows that it makes its way to Hamas very, very quickly. She had no idea whether it was going to go to terrorists or whether it was going to go to actual people in need. And there can be no doubt that most of it probably went to terrorists. The Labor Party, every time Israel was making some inroads into putting Hamas down and destroying Hamas, the Labor Party would constantly tell them to encourage them to a ceasefire. That is actually telling them to stop destroying the very terrorists who had attacked them. And then, of course, you had the Greens as well with their disgraceful comments talking about sort of Israel's tentacles all around the world. So in comparison to Labor, the Liberal Party and Dutton in particular have really been a beacon of moral clarity in this. They know who the victims are. They know who the perpetrators are. They know that the perpetrators, the terrorists, must be absolutely destroyed. And this is something that has tremendously set them apart from Labor, and not just Labor, but the ABC, the universities, and so much of the left-wing commentariat that seemed quicker to take the side of Hamas than it did to take the side of Israel.
Oh, absolutely. There were so many useful idiots for Hamas on the left. Evelyn, do you think Albanese's handling over the response to the war in the Middle East here will hurt him at the election?
I certainly do. I think there are going to be lots of things, that are going to hurt Albanese at the election. This is just one of the millions of things. But, this is such a big problem that's happening all over the West. And it's particularly happening in countries which are distinctly multicultural. Sadly, the Jewish community aren't the only victims of this. I think it was last week we had an absolute lunatic drive a car through Christians in Germany, killing 5 and injuring over 230 other people. We had a man in New South Wales recently stabbed in the face in his pulpit when he was doing a sermon. This is such a big problem, and we need strong leadership who will call right from wrong, who will call a spade, sort the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. But, these sorts of attacks are skyrocketing across the West, and in the West, we need leaders who will stand in truth and morality. There's a fundamental flaw with the philosophy of multiculturalism, and it's superficially unites, but fundamentally divides. And sadly, unless we properly diagnose the disease, we will never have a cure for it. And the Jewish community, the Christian community, and, the ideologies that made the West the best will die off if we don't have strong leaders to preserve that.
Look, I absolutely agree with you that it's not just the Jewish community under attack, it's everyone, the Western way of life and Judeo-Christian values, although although I think with the problem with multiculturalism isn't with all cultures. I mean, the Jewish culture has integrated really well here. It's that some cultures and some ideologies do not integrate with Western cultures, and we have to wake up and admit that. But look, let's move on to the damning news poll. And Stephen, I've already spoken about how Labor has lost ground in Victoria and New South Wales, and among people aged 35 to 49. What did you make of this analysis that came out today?
Yeah, I'm not entirely surprised. I think when you look back at sort of Labor over the last sort of 20 years, or certainly since the election of Rudd in 2007, the story is always the same. Australians feel that the country has sort of plateaued. And so kind of in a kind of hopeful spirit, they'll elect Labor into government, but are invariably disappointed. And that is exactly what has happened with the Albanese government. They were elected hoping that they'd be able to do something about inflation, something about the cost of living. But the government has proven to be one of the most dysfunctional, visionless, confused governments in recent political history. It made a huge issue of the voice at a time where people were losing their houses because mortgage payments were so high, at a time where people couldn't find places to rent because of a rental crisis, at a time where people couldn't afford even a house deposit. For Albanese, the real issue was some voice to Parliament. So it's not surprising that a few years on, people are realising that Labor are not the answer, and my prediction is that Liberal will win government at the next election. But there's also no guarantee that Liberal are going to be able to solve a lot of the problems. I think they're ahead of Labor, particularly on climate and energy policy, but they're not exactly where they ought to be on that. They should be far more robustly promoting coal. But so Liberal, I would describe right now as the lepers with the most fingers. But the Labor Party has proven to be an absolute disaster, and people are going to swing back to Liberal after a Labor disaster, as they always do.
Yeah, well, it will be interesting to see what happens at the polls. Look, let's move on to the holiday chaos. And Bronte residents woke up to Christmas rubbish at the beach this year. Again, now, Evelyn, why are people, and let's be honest, it's mainly backpackers here, but why are they such grubs?
Look, I think it's the infantile culture that we're fostering in Australia and many Western nations, sadly. It's complete and utter disrespect. And it goes back to, I think, that sort of state-enslaved mindset where, you know, people always feel like it's somebody else's responsibility, that daddy government, type thing, It's just disgusting. You don't leave that level of trash behind for somebody else to clean up unless you have a severely inflated sense of self-entitlement, let's be honest. I hope it's not due to the local councils cutting back on public garbage bins like we've been seeing happening everywhere. I mean, I went to the pro-life rally in Sydney Hyde Park not long ago. Not only could I not find a restroom, I couldn't find a bin to put anywhere. So I hope that that's not the problem. If it is the problem,
actually put out
perhaps
more
local
bins
councils should use their funds better spent, doing things like this, particularly around the holidays, by upping, waste disposal methods and things like that, instead of, perhaps, spending millions of dollars on cultural diversity training. That's my tip.
I think in fairness to the council, they apparently, reportedly, put out more bins. They put out extra bins because last year this has been such an issue. So I think the problem this time, for once, we can't blame the councils. I think it just is people being grubs. Look, let's move on to the US now, where Donald Trump continues to get down to business ahead of his inauguration. The president-elect has vowed to pursue the death penalty for violent crimes the day after Joe Biden commuted the death sentences of most prisoners on death row. Now, Trump posted to his platform Truth Social that he will direct the Justice Department to vigorously pursue the death penalty to protect American families and children from violent rapists, murderers, and monsters. We will be a nation of law and order again, Trump added. Now, Stephen, this might be welcome news for Americans who are sick of violent crime taking over cities like New York, who are sick of undocumented migrants. Do you think that this will go down well among voters?
Absolutely, it will. I mean, voters have been wanting tougher law and order for many, many years. And we've got to be clear that we do talk about the Biden government, but in fact, it's not Biden making any of these decisions. It's a very far left cabal within the Democratic Party that is doing this purely for ideological reasons. They have an ideological objection to the death penalty. They would say the death penalty is actually racist. They would say the whole prison system is racist. And it's just amazing that, I mean, they're doing this now because they couldn't have got away with doing anything like this earlier, because they literally are commuting sentences from death to life of people who are horrifically cruel torturers and murderers. You don't show mercy to people who have been merciless to others. I mean, if anyone is going to show mercy to those people, it's God, but it should not be the state. Now, I actually happen to think that the death penalty is fundamentally grounded in the dignity of human life. That is, that human life is so sacred, that is, innocent human life is so sacred that when it is taken in first-degree murder, the proper punishment is death. And so in actual fact, the death penalty is premised on a very good principle, the sacredness of human life. And that principle has more or less been thrown out over the last 60 years. And I would ask people, since that principle has been thrown out and people have turned against the death penalty all around the West, do we think the justice system has gotten better for victims, or has it gotten worse? And I'll just leave you with that.
Yeah, look, I grew up in Singapore and they have the death penalty there, and it's worked for them in terms of crime, that's for sure. But I know it's not very popular in Australia. Now, Steve and Evelyn, thank you both for your time tonight. That's all we have time for.